Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
Politics and religion. We see the Jesse Jacksons, the Pat Robertsons on television, but what effect are they having on our political parties and our political process? Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll talk about them and where we're headed politically, religiously, and what the effects will be. Our panelists today are Dr. George Jones, Director of Religious Programs at Ball State University, Bruce Galehood from the Department of History here at Ball State, and John Rouse from the Department of Political Science. Dr. Jones, like I mentioned, we see television has brought the Pat Robertsons, the Jesse Jacksons into our homes. It seems like a recent phenomenon, but I guess it's really not to have religious personalities involved in our politics.
No, the ideal in the 19th century was that America would be a Christian nation, not on the basis of a state church which people would be coerced, but on the basis of popular opinion, on the basis of persuasion. So the churches were a very important part of that, deciding what a Christian nation should look like in the 19th century, and a very important part of mobilizing people to put into effect that vision of what a Christian nation ought to be. So they were really in the forefront of 19th century politics.
What makes, I guess, the Jesse Jacksons and the Pat Robertsons so visible today? Is it the medium of television that's brought them into our homes?
I think that has a lot to do with it. There are other accompanying factors that go with use of television. One's the ability to raise vast sums of money through direct appeal. That's gotten coupled also with the direct mail approach to raising money. You can mobilize vast audiences and large amounts of money.
Is this going to be a significant force, Bruce Galehood? I mean, we're talking about perhaps a force that we haven't seen in terms of mobilizing those voters. They talked about what the religious right did for Ronald Reagan, but then, you know, there's some question about that. Mm-hmm. Is this a force to be reckoned with politically?
If you look at it right now, Larry, I would have to say that the answer to the question would be yes. The way the primaries are set up now, particularly the Democratic primary, as I understand, a number of Democratic candidates running in the large southern regional primaries coming up in 1988 could fragment the vote in such a fashion that Jesse Jackson could wind up as the winner. And Jesse Jackson's appeal is on the basis of somewhat of religion and the fact that he campaigned in that fashion in 1984 and is sort of a spokesman in this sense. I think the Republicans are looking at Pat Robertson right now. He's not a declared candidate. He's not even probably as far down the road, at least in terms of public perception, as a candidate as let's say, George Bush or Jack Kemp, or maybe we could list a couple other maybe prominent Senate Republicans that might fit into that category. But it seems pretty clear that he's testing the water pretty strongly, and that if he goes in, that will contribute to a pretty severe challenge to the way Republicans have normally run their campaigns on the basis of establishment candidates supported by party faithful, or in the case of somebody like Jack Kemp, who's trying to mobilize grassroots appeal around the country. So it will be a much different scenario, shall we say, in 1988 from the standpoint as we look at it in 1986, as we examine religion and politics.
John Rouse, Pat Robertson is not a typical politician. Perhaps he's perceived as someone with a special interest in mind, whatever those issues might be that the religious right specifically want to address. Can a guy like that be successful?
Well, he hasn't been so far. I think the couple of things that Jackson and Robertson have in common is the fact that they never have run for office, and they haven't been tested as far as their programs or their ideas. So I think if they were really serious about running for president, they would run for an office that they supposedly could win, and then they could test their ideas, and then they could perhaps run for higher office, but they haven't done this yet, at least.
Some people call them power brokers. Do you see this as the role that they really are wanting to play, rather than being the candidate? They want to affect the platform and...
Yeah, the writer from the New York Times, Bill Safire, he calls both Jackson and Robertson the poly preachers, and that they are block leaders and they both hold up the litmus test, so to speak, in terms of the politics of both parties. For example, recently, the Right to Life group had a convention in Denver, and all of the Republican politicians seemed to fall in behind that position. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, so to speak, Jackson's people and the Democrats will tend to fall into the position of Jesse Jackson and black voters.
Well, Sapphire's position, they really don't intend to be or expect to be elected president. They're just using it as pretty much a platform to espouse their ideas. Of course, when you get somebody like Pat Robertson, who has a fundraising mechanism set up already, he then qualifies for federal funds to help finance his campaign.
If he's a declared candidate.
If he's a declared candidate. But how difficult is that?
True.
Easy enough, and you raise the funds, and then all of a sudden the American taxpayer is helping to finance his espousal of whatever ideas he'd like to spew forward.
Yeah, I think that one thing that the viewers or the listeners of this program might focus upon is that these two gentlemen are very important in the next year or so in terms of raising agenda. And they will indeed be raising agendas. In a sense, they will be forcing those people within their own parties to respond to their particular issue. And they may be doing themselves a service from that point of view.
Larry, you raised an interesting point here about the campaign finance laws and how, at least in the case of somebody like a Pat Robertson, let's say, how with a fundraising organization in place, it is so much easier now to raise the amount of money in small donations, less than $1,000, let's say, although that may not seem small. But in the small donations, which then qualify you for federal matching funds, which allow you to wage a campaign. And certainly that has increased the number of presidential candidates. People are running for president now, or at least in '84 and perhaps in '80, who maybe would not have done so had they had to raise the vast amounts of money necessary to do the campaign without the support of federal matching funds. And so that law, that change in the law in the mid-'70s, really a decade later is tailor-made for somebody who has a national following, even if it's a narrow one.
Mm-hmm. And who can focus on a single issue or two.
Or, yeah, and can find his appeal essentially approaches 2 or 3 issues and can generate that sort of network of small contributors, which just lays the Federal Election Commission laws right open for you. And perhaps a man like Robertson and even Jackson, that's what they're counting on to a certain extent. And I really question a little bit whether or not it's a person's intent to be elected. I think maybe Sapphire might be overstating it a little bit. I think just about anybody that runs for president at least entertains the idea, at least in their own mind, that they might have a bit of a chance. And or possibly hold out for perhaps the vice presidential slot on a ticket or something like that. But they really do, I think, have serious designs on an office or an office of major importance, if not the presidency, something else.
I think this is especially true of Robertson, who's now emphasizing his background in law and his business administration abilities.
Well, we're seeing a new Pat Robertson here, though. Mm-hmm. I mean, like we mentioned, the new and improved Pat Robertson. He's sort of a lot milder than he used to be. I mean, you don't hear a lot of the emphasis on his faith healing, on his speaking in tongues, and we've got a different kind of man here who wants a different perception with the American voters, isn't that right?
Yeah, I just a couple of years ago, or several years ago, he was predicting essentially the end of the world. And I believe he was even in print on that particular issue. But I think we should focus on a couple of things. First of all, in terms of why the issue of politics and religion. In about a month or so, the 1st of August, there's going to be a caucus in the Republican party system in Michigan, and that will tell us to some degree how much influence there is there in terms of Pat Robertson. And of course, Bruce is an expert on the Republican Party. So let me ask Bruce, getting back to this issue of the litmus test, how much of a litmus test will the conservative Christians be in the Republican Party, you think?
Well, I think they're a strong factor right now, and to a certain extent, the Republicans, including the Reagan campaign in 1984, helped to what's the best word here? Engender it, promote it, support it, I know Senator Laxalt, who was a key figure in the Reagan campaign in 1984, had a very strong direct mail campaign out to Protestant clergymen, as I understand, asking for them for their support for the Reagan-Bush ticket in '84. So that affiliation, if you will, that attempt to identify conservative, Republican, evangelical voters of various denominational stripes has been something that's been going on since at least 1980, very organized attempt in 1984, and I would expect that you would see that certainly a man like Pat Robertson can step into that, knowing that there is a rather substantial constituency. How large it is, nobody knows. Michigan might give us some indication about that. But remember, in primary states, it's sometimes a 30% or a 25% showing in an election is sometimes hailed by the press and the media in general as a victory, even if you don't win. And it provides them some momentum for your campaign.
And of course, this is a down-home issue because the Republican nomination in the primary was captured by a gentleman by the name of Lynch, who is from Indianapolis, and he's the pastor of a Nazarene church, and so therefore that's a direct Indiana connection here in this district. And also, Pat Robertson came to Indiana to campaign for Butcher, who indeed defeated the establishment Republican candidate Ridlin. So we have right here in Indiana the impact of politics and religion.
George mentioned the fact that religion and politics is at least a 19th century phenomenon. I think back a little bit more recently, too. I think it was in 1972-73, Ben Wattenberg, the political pollster, published a book called The Real America, where he highlighted the so-called social issue and how many voters, assuming that the economy isn't in terrible condition and there's relative stability and peace, at least as far as the United States is concerned, as far as any troops being committed any place in the world, really focus in on such issues as abortion, as school prayer, and we can run through that rather familiar list. And they are trying to identify, that is a major concern of theirs, and consequently they're looking for candidates. Now back in that particular period of time, there weren't many candidates who were trying to espouse those particular issues as the substance, I think it's fair to say, of their political programs. They were pursuing other sorts of things. But the issue was there, and now we're seeing it come a decade later into much stronger focus. And we're probably going to see much more of it now in 2 years.
How scared is the Republican establishment of this monster that they've adopted into their family?
Well, I think there's concern. Let's take a man like Ed Rollins, who was a key figure in the Reagan campaign in 1984 and will probably be involved in the campaign in '88 on one side for one candidate or another, or at least in terms of the Republican National Committee's effort. The concern there is probably the uncertainty of it. How much support will he get? Who will he pull away from? Will it weaken the campaign of the strongest Republican that can run against the Democrat, and will that be something akin to what happened in '76 with Reagan and Ford, where Reagan really bruised Ford in the primaries and in the nomination process, and he didn't really lead a totally united party against Jimmy Carter, and consequently lost the election as a result. Jimmy Carter, we shouldn't neglect that, was a presidential candidate who, although not a clergyman, certainly made much use of the religious issue in terms of his own personal beliefs, and that had a certain amount of appeal, especially in the South and in certain parts of the West in 1976.
We look at the agenda, and we talked about that. The religious right took some credit for Ronald Reagan's election, for making him president. Yet, when you turn to Congress in terms of school prayer and in terms of abortion, they've not been very successful. What horizon are they looking for now? Are they looking for something much broader, more than just a president? Do they need a Congress? How do they establish their agenda and win that kind of support for it?
Well, it seems to me that the agenda is somewhat clear. Those who are the so-called religious right is actually actively promoting an amendment for school prayer. They were interested in that a while back. They certainly want much stronger legislation on the abortion issue than what Congress has done. Now, President Reagan will be witnessing, shall we say, through his two new appointees to the Supreme Court, the judicial situation as it relates to the Supreme Court, and the religious right, if you will, that group, is much much more vocal perhaps than it's been in the past on the question of what the standing of these two justices might be about such things as abortion. So they're quite active.
If I can respond to that, there was a book written a couple of years ago based upon a survey by a fellow by the name of Stuart Rothenberg. He's the director of the Conservative Institute for Government and Politics, and he was co-author of this book. The book was called The Evangelical Voter. And some of the conclusions of this were very surprising. For example, one conclusion of the survey was that about a fourth of the evangelicals are fundamentalists in theology and conservative in politics. Of course, a not so surprising result was that 90% of the evangelicals surveyed supported school prayer. A surprising focus, however, was that by 2 to 1, evangelicals supported the Equal Rights Amendment. So my point is that evangelicals are not as
monolithic
in terms of how they might vote.
How does well, I guess getting back to my question, how does the religious right then establish some support or achieve its goals and its agenda? Or does it? Are the ideas, the religious right, however we define that, the ideas of school prayer, the ideas of abortion, are they so far out of midstream America that they will never be adopted? Are they just very idealistic of a very small group? Or are we going to see some movement because of this infusion of religion into politics? Are we going to see movement on these issues for the religious right?
My guess is they're working on 3 fronts, and I say guess because I'm not very close to it. One, they're working at the point of public opinion to mobilize their forces. I think it's interesting that Jerry Falwell has quit using the term moral majority. I think he'd hoped by that term to bring in 40 to 60 million Roman Catholics, 30 million evangelicals, 2 or 3 million Orthodox Jews, and plus Mormons and a few other groups into what would be a majority on certain moral issues. He was unable to do that because this conservative group in America are much more diverse than he thought at that point. So I think they're moving in the area of public opinion. I think secondarily they are moving in Congress. I don't think the nomination for the Republican in the 2nd District is a fluke. I think it was a deliberate campaign effort. People in Indianapolis knew more about it than people in Muncie did. And then I think thirdly they need a national figurehead, spokesman like Ronald Reagan, and Robertson can be that kind of national spokesman.
George, if I could follow up, just a couple of weeks you were a delegate, I believe, at the Southern Baptist Convention, which was held in Atlanta. And of course, Baptists are a group that are very active in terms of conservative politics.
They're generally viewed to be probably the largest constituency in the religious right. Yeah.
What's the impact then upon Indiana here, of course, in terms of these groups and essentially how is Indiana churched?
Well, unlike the South, where you've got 2 or 3 denominations that make up most of the religious right, in Indiana you're talking about 20 or 30 denominations. So the appeal is much more of a non-denominational, trans-denominational approach here in Indiana. I think as far as the Southern Baptist Convention was concerned, there was a direct play to capture the sentiment of the people there. The president of the convention read a letter from Ronald Reagan, and it wasn't a simple greeting. It was a rousing campaign pitch. Get on my bandwagon. We'll run the liberals out of town. With your help, we can do away with abortion. We can establish school prayer. Most blatant political message under the guise of a greeting to the convention.
Is Indiana ripe for somebody like Pat Robertson? I mean, is this the kind of state where he could do very well if he's going against a George Bush?
I think it's hard to say. We were talking about his, and I don't say that to fudge on the question. You talked earlier about how he's becoming the new Pat Robertson. He's stressing other issues, national defense, sound economy, which heretofore really haven't been the focus of his effort as much as some of these so-called social issues. And I wonder to what extent, if he's going to try to broaden his appeal in that sense, that in the process of doing that he'll dilute some of his strength, and it'll become clear in the course of campaigning, or it'll become less clear in the course of campaigning what he really stands for in that sense. Are you for these so-called social issues, or are you just another Republican saying Republican theme, campaign themes plus the social issue, and where's your real conviction, where's your heart lie? Now, that might be a problem for him, and I still think that in a lot of voters' minds in terms of the primary, voters can vote to make a statement, such as voting for somebody on the religious right that has appeal in a narrow range of things, or they can vote for the candidate that they think will be the best candidate for the party to run in the general election. And so that's where, if Robertson does not seem to be as strong as Bush relative to, let's say, other Democrats, or Kemp relative to other Democrats, then I don't think he'll do well. But if he has strength combined with the appeal of the social issues, he could run very strongly. Indiana's a conservative state.
And if you just don't throw it into a Robertson-Bush race,
Sure.
but you throw Kemp in there three ways,
Sure.
and like you mentioned,
Sure.
if you win 25 or 30% of the vote in a race like that,
It was asked earlier. Yeah, that's right. It was asked earlier in the program here. How do the Republicans perceive him? I read recently where Paul Kirk, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and whether this is a true statement or not, had circulated a memo saying Pat Robertson might be the strongest Republican to run in 1988 because of the factors we've listed before. He has people that will go out and work for him. He has a fundraising arm. He has national name recognition through CBN, and he could be a very, very formidable candidate. So
The Republicans have, of course, tried to survey on this kind of concern, and they claim that about 30% of the voters who expect to vote in 1988 respond strongly to a Republican style, a Robertson style campaign. So it is a minority of the Republicans who tend to focus upon this.
And I think for that reason, Robertson probably would have more difficulty in Indiana than he would a lot of other states. Indiana has probably one of the strongest Republican establishments of any state in the Union. Robertson will probably have his greatest impact on states where the Republican Party is rather new, where their organization is not as strong as it is here in Indiana.
unless, of course, you have a Kemp Bush who are pretty much splitting the Republican mainstream vote.
the problem, I think, with that, George, to a certain extent, and I think what you say may be correct, but you have the situation with Don Lynch, who was running against an establishment, or at least a candidate in the Republican primary who had establishment backing, if you will.
But hadn't the establishment kind of gone to sleep, though, in the campaign?
Oh, the extent to which they worked in this person's behalf, that's another question. But what Lynch had, as I understand, was relatively little financing, but tremendous, at least for a primary, volunteer support. He had several hundred people, as I understand, out, handing out tracts, knocking on doorbells, telling people about this is Don Lynch. And he was better mobilized in that sense. And that, without saying so, I suspect, that was part of his appeal, that he is a grassroots individual. He's not part of the establishment. He's this independent Republican man out running for office. And that has a certain amount of appeal at certain times in political campaigns. If you're not part of an organization, if you're not well-heeled financially, if you don't have the so-called big shots backing you, you're just a man out there fighting like everybody else.
He also had the advantage of the fact that pornography has been an issue in Indianapolis for some time, and there was already a very strong anti-pornography organization that he could tap into.
Since we're moving up towards the 4th of July, a celebration coming close to the 200th anniversary of our country, I think it's good to look at what the role of religion in the First Amendment, and at least my study of the picture is that the founders were either what I would call institutionalized Christians, meaning members of the Anglican Church, which would mean very close to the structure of government at that time, or they were deists, as was the case, I believe, for Thomas Jefferson and also for Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson even predicted that America would be a Unitarian kind of association in terms of religion. So the point I'm trying to make, and it sort of gets back to George's point, is how Indiana is churched, and the this issue of the fundamentalists, in a sense, is not one that goes back 200 years ago, but goes back maybe 50 years ago or 60 years ago or in the last century. They focus upon the great Enlightenment period and that kind of focus.
Well, the First Amendment has two clauses that relate to religion. One's the no establishment of religion, and the other is the non-interference with religious practice. And both of these, I think, were instituted by different, as you say, by the Enlightenment rationalists and the sectarians at the time, gave it strong support because they took the role of religion very seriously. They didn't want the state interfering with religion, that religion in its pure form should not be contaminated by the state. And then on the other side, they didn't want a state that was run by clerics. So you had both of those factors going, and they were against theocracy as they had seen it in New England, and they were against a state church that they had seen in England, both of which they saw to be weak and impotent and not serving the public good.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of giving the illustration that you gave a few minutes ago in the Southern Baptist Convention, you see the very close association between Reagan's policies and the church policies.
Yeah, and I think it's very unhealthy because any religious group that identifies specific political issues, identifies with specific political issues too much, can lose their moral force. They can no longer rise above and judge all issues on an ethical basis. They become so identified with one or two issues.
Hasn't Reagan been somewhat of a disappointment to the religious right?
Sure. He hasn't pushed very hard there. He's been much more interested in economics and foreign policy.
On his agenda, but not a high priority, has sort of been his approach.
I think he's had the rhetoric that's appealed to the new right, but and he's given him a lot of lip service, but he's being faulted for not following through.
Hasn't produced.
No,
all right.
No.
We're out of time today. Thanks to our panelists, Bruce Galehood, George Jones, and John Rouse for their commentary. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.